Welcome to Brownfield's Next Gen podcast, where the future of agriculture gets a voice. This is your stop for real-world wisdom, fresh perspectives, and straight-shooting conversations that address some of the biggest challenges facing the next generation of farmers and ranchers. From planting to big-picture profits, we talk to the experts and dig into the tools, trends, and tough decisions shaping your operation and your legacy. Now, here are your hosts, Erin Anderson and Kellan Heavican.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Erin Anderson here with Kellan Heavican. Welcome to the Next Gen podcast on Brownfield.
Thanks, Erin. This week, Renee Wiatt with Purdue University joins us to talk a little about business planning as we think of succession planning and farm transition. Renee, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Renee, in a previous episode, we were talking about transition planning at kind of the first overarching level. And one of the things we heard in that was there's the difference between a transition or succession plan and a business plan. And the first being more of the who and the what, and then the business plan obviously is the financials that are involved. So to get us started, Renee, talk about what is a business plan in regards to succession planning and how that can help provide for a smooth transition of an operation.
Sure. So having a business plan drafted and, filled out really takes a lot of thought and strategic decision making. And a lot of times what we like to tell entrepreneurs, family business owners, farms, you want to start your business with an exit plan in mind, right? These two are very closely tied. And especially in farms, that business plan and that succession plan can really go hand in hand, determining, what our long-term strategic goals are, what the financials look like, can we support that next generation, and really giving it a vehicle from moving the business from one generation to the next, actually having that written down, having people on the same page as to what's to come is really, really important. So those two are very closely tied.
Now, I think you mentioned that piece about farm financials. A lot of times we've heard some stories about new generational members coming into the operation not knowing what the farm finances were prior to inheriting the farm or really getting involved in that. Can you take that a step further and talk about the importance of really discussing farm financials and what that entails in terms of the next generation?
Yeah. So one of the questions I get quite a bit is, can we afford to bring in the next generation? Right? If that incumbent, that senior generation, a lot of times they don't know what it takes to bring in that next generation. If they don't know what it takes to bring in that next generation, I'm guessing that the successors on the other side probably don't know what the farm financials look like. A lot of times we see that incumbent generation kind of wanting to hide the farm financials from the successor because they always made it work, right? They sacrificed a ton. They had really lean years. We know with rising input costs right now, it's really tight in the farm industry. And so I think that it's very, very important, though, to share those financials and be open and honest with both generations. One thing that I encourage farm families to do if they're thinking about going through a transition is to go meet with the banker, go meet with the lender, go meet with FSA, get a real holistic picture of the farm, its operations, and the financials so both generations are on the same page and they know what it takes to do it. Whether that's the successor generation having to get, an off-farm job at the beginning, maybe maybe the farm is in a situation where that successor generation has to buy in or start buying equipment or start, putting money into that. They need to be upfront and honest so that everybody knows what to do to make the farm successful.
Renee, is we keep throwing out farm financials. What does that mean? Drill down when we think of the succession planning piece of this. What does farm financials mean?
Yeah, so for me, farm financials means looking at those ratios. I'm not in that farm financial world a lot, right? I'm more on the communication side, but we want to make sure that we have strong ratios. We want to make sure the farm can, borrow money if they need to. We need to make sure that we have enough income to the farm to support both generations and both of the family's living costs. There's a lot that goes into that, but just an overall, we want a financially healthy farm if we're going to try to pass that on to the next generation.
Kind of along those same lines, Renee, production methods, trying to understand how the current generation does things, and maybe how the next generation can take that a step further and maybe implement their own processes, do things their own way.
Mhm.
How do they kind of combine some of those in that business plan?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we really need to look at who's making the decisions. And I try to emphasize to that incumbent generation that the successor generation might do things a little bit differently. And basically, if they're going to hand over the management keys to that farm, they have to be okay with some things changing. Right. So it needs to be an ongoing discussion. We have that, that senior generation who's, got that product loyalty. They've, been with this, they've bought this type of seed, they've done dealings with this co-op for so long. They probably want to keep that going in that way, whereas the successor generation, they might be shopping around for the best price, maybe really comparing hybrids and looking at performance. There's this generational divide. We really need to understand both perspectives, and both generations need to communicate through that in order to make decisions. We can line out in our succession plan and in our business plan how decisions are made, who makes what decision, how does that decision making of the successor generation over time increase, and we have the incumbent generation, their decision making power kind of decrease, where they become more of a consultant for that successor generation, trying to just foster and help them make good decisions, but also giving them some autonomy to make the decisions themselves and learn how to do that.
One of the things that I'm thinking about is so we've got a transition succession plan, we've got farm financials, and then we're talking about a business plan. So, what needs to be
Mhm.
included in a business plan under this umbrella?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that need to be included in the business plan. I will give a plug for Purdue. We do have an online business planner. It's called InVenture. It walks you through every step of that business plan. Goals, objectives, mission, vision, the financials. What do they look like in the best case scenario, our worst case scenario, and maybe our predicted, where we think we'll be. Um, there's a lot of steps in that business plan that need to be covered, but we have a great template for that.
You talked about the exit strategy being kind of the forefront of this conversation. Um,
Uh-huh.
how do the previous generation kind of prepare for that? Trying to exit the operation. I know that that can also be a pretty difficult conversation to have.
Yeah, so that senior generation, a lot of times, and we're seeing it more and more, they're delaying retirement, they're delaying transition. And so sometimes we have these farm families where we have a 70-year-old, and they have kids who are 65, or a 70-year-old, and then they have kids that are 45, and those 45-year-olds still haven't taken over the farm yet. Right? They're still not making the decisions. We see a lot of delays in that. We recently did a survey of farmers in the Midwest, and a lot of them they classified themselves as rich and ready to go, which means they're financially and mentally ready. But then on the flip side of that, we have quite a few who are, financially ready, but they're not mentally ready to let go. So I think a lot of times we get these incumbents who are, financially they're fine, they're great, they could retire if they want, but their whole being is really tied up in the farm. It's their legacy, it's their identity, it's who they are in the community, it's who they are in their family even. And so we see that, that retirement being delayed and delayed and delayed, and that ultimately can cause issues for the successor generation. So we need to make sure that we have a roadmap and a plan for how things are going to transition. Otherwise, we can see that successor generation, even if they're 45 years old with kids in college, right? We can see that successor generation kind of choosing other routes other than the farm. And it could skip a generation and go to their kids, or there's a lot of different ways that can go. But it's really
I know that
interesting to
this
see.
is slightly off of our topic, Renee, but I think it's worth following up on, though, is the idea of what's causing the older generation to be less willing to potentially start the conversations and have a plan in place.
That's a really, really good question. I have not been able to pinpoint what it is. I mean, I know people are living longer, but even with people living longer, we're seeing that delayed retirement, delayed retirement. I think it's been accepted in the farming community when people say, when are you going to retire? And they say, oh, I'm going to die in my tractor. Ha ha ha. They laugh about it, but I think they mean it, right? They want to keep working. They want to keep having that purpose. I don't know the key reason why we're delaying retirements and not retiring, but I think the communication can help us through that in a lot of ways.
Renee, I wanted to touch on a little bit of the operational goals as well. When we're
Hmm.
talking about these exit strategies, trying to pinpoint what the expectation is for the incoming generation to kind of craft this business plan in terms of kind of combining some of those goals. How do the incumbent generation and the next generation kind of combine their goals together to find common ground?
Yeah. So we work with farms quite a bit on setting goals. When we think about, we have personal goals of each individual in the farm, then we have, business goals, and then we also have this shared family vision, hopefully, that drives us through. When we're thinking about those business goals, it can be really different among the generations. And for some reason, it's hard to come to terms on this just because they have very different goals for the business. But, a lot of times what we see them agree on is wanting to have operational continuity, right? So we want the business to stay in the family. We want our family to keep running the business. We want that to be a way of life for our business. So asking some questions like, where do we want to be 20 years from now? What does that look like for each person? How flexible are you on where you want to be? Are you willing to give up some things on the farm? Some, methods that we're using, production choices in order to make sure that the farm stays in the family and continues. Um, it can cause a lot of conflict, but families that we see succeed are ones that have that shared, family vision and shared farm vision and are able to articulate that, and we're aligned through generations and they're able to work towards that.
You know, I'm sitting here and listening to our conversation, and in my head, I'm like, well, this is all great when when producers and operations are financially healthy and they're
Yeah.
ready.
Yeah.
But if we look at the broader ag economy right now, we're hearing when Aaron and I talk to producers, I'm sure you hear the same thing when you talk to producers about
Hmm.
margins, profitability, bottom lines, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah.
my question is, how does the industry navigate transitioning farms when there is so much uncertainty, profitability is under pressure? How do we go about doing that when we don't always have a good idea on where the economy is headed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Some of my recent research has looked into, how successors make their decision to come back to the family farm or not. And those structural barriers, we preach communication constantly, right? But when it comes down to it, you have to have money, right? Everybody has to live. So those structural barriers are really causing an issue for that successor generation to come back to the farm in terms of, health insurance. How are we going to pay for health insurance? Looking at land access, right? How are we going to find extra acres to farm? How are we going to find the money to buy extra farmland? We have these structural barriers, and we also have this lack of communication, and it's really, really causing an issue. I think fundamentally, we need some policy changes would be ideal, right, to help support farmers through these tight years. Having some kind of program to help the younger generation finance their entry if that's needed. Sometimes in order for the current owners to exit, they need to be bought out, right? And that's just the reality. When that younger generation graduates high school or graduates college and comes back, they probably don't have a ton of cash, and that's really what's needed sometimes for them to enter that farm business, and that really causes a problem.
One thing that came to mind is we're talking about needing capital. I know a
Mhm.
lot of I shouldn't say a lot of farms. I know of farms that carry a lot of debt.
Mhm.
And, I can also see the next generation saying, I don't want to carry that much debt. So, how do
Yeah.
you navigate transitioning a farm with some level of debt from the older generation?
Yeah, that can be really tricky. A lot of times what we've seen is, especially when we're talking about, land, if we have those principal payments that are due, what we see a lot of times is the successor generation just cash renting the farm from the current generation, the incumbent generation, providing a means of cash flow for them to pay their principal payments, but also allowing, the successor generation to start gaining some income on their own. That's one way we see it. It is really tight though. And, that could be a reason we're really seeing delayed retirements too. How do you retire when you still owe, $250,000 on your combine? How do we do that? How do we, feasibly say, yeah, that makes sense for me to retire when you have all these payments hanging over you.
I want to throw another scenario out there, Renee.
Uh-huh.
I think a lot of times we see the older generation kind of like delaying that retirement, as you said. Um,
Uh-huh.
but at the same time, maybe that younger generation is coming in during the good times of the ag economy.
Uh-huh.
But then all of a sudden, they don't have the support from the older generation that they had prior, in that transition period. How do they navigate, some of that without the support? What are some of the risk management strategies that they can implement to help them through some of those lean times?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of times, to be honest, we see, that off-farm income coming into play, whether it's, a spouse themselves, whatever that looks like. We also see quite a bit of diversification. If we're talking about risk management, diversifying what we do, especially for some of those specialty crop growers. If they have an apple orchard, they also bring in agritourism, right? We try to think about how we can diversify and finding different ways to bring in income on the same resources that we have and the assets that we do have.
Kind of along in the same vein,
Mhm.
what are steps? So maybe there's an operation out there that's like, okay, I'm not ready to transition yet because for multitude of reasons, age is probably what's coming to my head. But and for producers who are just starting out, but as we think real as they think really long term, what are some things that they need to be thinking about so that they don't have to all of a sudden look and go, well, I'm 75. I want to retire, but I have a $250,000 note on a combine, or I've
Mhm.
got all this debt because of land that I have. So, what are
Yeah.
things producers can do now as they think long term to put them in a better financial position when it comes to some of the larger issues?
I think a lot of times in farms, what we see is this trade off between, avoiding taxes now versus having cash. And so a lot of times we see, we're going to get a better truck, we're going to get a better tractor, we're going to keep trading and trading and trading. But if you think long term, it might be better off financially overall to wait a little bit, right? Have some reserves, try to think about strategically long term, right? We're doing okay right now in the farm economy. What if we have a bad year? Trying to have some reserves on hand, trying to make sure that we can operate the farm and it be self sufficient without pulling in from those off farm incomes. I think that's what I would encourage producers to think about. Can we be sustainable in our own farm? And what does that look like? Right? Maybe that means renting more versus buying. Maybe that means keeping the combine and depreciating it a few more years versus getting a brand new one, right? There's these small decisions, it seems small decisions that incrementally can really build up to a big difference when we think long term and looking at the financial health of a farm.
Renee, for those producers that are going through this process right now and are thinking about some of their long term goals, what they need to do to craft a successful business plan for the future, what are the
Mhm.
biggest key takeaways that they need to consider as they are making some of these decisions right now?
So one of the biggest decisions, I think, one of the biggest things to consider, I think, is just getting input from the current owners and then also the future managers. We want to make sure that not only the plan works for who's currently owning, but also for that next generation. A lot of times we see that incumbent generation say, "Well, they'll figure it out when I'm dead. They'll figure out what's going on when I'm dead." Really in reality, what that just causes is turmoil, and it causes sibling relationships to break down. What we want to see is a plan laid out. Bring it to the next generation. The next generation says, "Okay, I like it. This is what I would change." Come to some agreement on those plans and what they look like. That will ultimately lead us into success for the succession plan and also for the business plan. Sometimes we see business plans that are so narrow, it doesn't allow for, changing course or making different decisions. We want to make sure that our business plan and our succession plan are flexible enough where if small things are changed, that's okay, but also a long-term strategy that helps us all work towards that shared vision.
Renee, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, what's maybe a final parting thought that you have when we think of the financial readiness of farms to pass it on to the next generation?
Um, I think that it's really, really important that both generations look at the books. They actually see what's coming out of the farm, what's going in, meeting with those consultants, whether it be the attorney, the lender, the insurance agent, FSA. I ideally would like to see both generations meet with those consultants and communicate through that strategy so they know what they're getting into, and there's not the wool pulled over their eyes. We want people to be able to communicate and have a successful farm business in the future, but we also want those family relationships to be strong and not damaged. So ideally communicating through that will lead us to that, I think.
Renee, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for tuning in. With Kellan Heavican, I'm Erin Anderson for Brownfield.